Hi, everybody. This is Shanice Brown, and today I am talking about Johnson Chapter 8 Ethics, Rights, and Values Without the Heat. So, Johnson starts off this book, or sorry, not the book, but the chapter with an introduction. And the introduction is basically an example about a guy who just got his BCBA as a practitioner, and he actually goes around to different places that practice ABA work. And what happened is people were looking at choice. And so this actually brings up my first question. So while he was looking at choice, Tobin, I think that's his name, uh, he feels that choice should not be looked at as a value. So my first question is, do you agree with Tobin? Why or why not? So after the example, it goes into ethics and ethical communities. Our social environment helps us to create ethical standards that helps us to look at behavior that is appropriate or inappropriate. Ethical standards can also deal with behaviors that indirectly affect us. When I looked at this example and I looked at uh, the chapter and ethical and ethics communities and everything like that, it definitely reminded me about the way the media is nowadays, like especially with the news. So my example for the ethical standards indirectly affecting us is definitely like when we learn about child abuse from the news and everything like that. It affects us. It makes us sad. So it's indirectly affecting us because we're it makes us sad, and we're taught to it's seen as a social disapproval for a child to be abused. So because it's seen as a social disapproval, that comes from our ethical communities. So we're learning about that, and it's indirect because it's coming from the news. An ethical community, sorry, this quotation is also coming from the book. An ethical community is made up of members who share participation in contingencies that reinforce or punish certain behavioral practices. And then also, what I got out of that is who you are around depends on the behavior you are likely to have. A good example that I thought of with this is, my own personal example. So when I'm at my dad's house, when it comes to cooking or doing dishes or anything like that, I have to clean my dish right away, like clean the pots and pans right away. As soon as I'm done eating, I have to clean the plate right away. Everything in this has to be clean. But when I'm at my mom's house, she rather have everyone to eat their food first and finish eating before we clean the kitchen and clean the dishes. So it's just like a different behavior. I'm more uptight around my dad's house just because it's so much. He's a little OCD. So, we do a lot of cleaning as soon as we're done with stuff there. Um, yeah. So the book then goes into rights. Rights are what serves as our verbal behavior. When it comes to rights, we are making statements on what or who helps to obtain reinforcement or avoid punishment. Um, when this next bullet is kind of confusing, but when we are describing rights, we are making sure that the person that we are in the situation with knows that we will not give them permission to continue in the current situation. So a good example of this would be like, I don't know, when I was younger, I used to like shutting my door a lot, but I actually was not allowed to shut my door. But I felt like it was my personal right to have my own privacy in my room. So that means it was my personal right to have my door shut. So that's what I would argue with my parents about, is basically, it's whether or not I give them permission to keep my door open or not when I'm in there. Yeah. The next bullet states sometimes our rights can feel like they are being ignored depending on our environment. Um, and also our verbal statements equals our right statements. When we make statements involving our rights, we want our rights to be heard and to be applied to the situation. So that's basically manding. Then also our rights are also looked at as tacting. And then we should also be reminded that our rights are not superior than others. So basically, sometimes our rights may clash with others. Sometimes, what one person might feel about, I don't know, about brushing their teeth at night, I might feel indifferently about. But just because their rights and their situations, just because they may feel like that, doesn't mean that, my thoughts and my rights and my statements are, above theirs. Everybody's is not necessarily equal, but everybody's is, around the same. And the next, underneath rights, the next section was, and where do our rights come from? Our rights originated from our environment, quote unquote, our ethical communities. Our statements and other actions concerning rights are fully controlled by our ethical communities, whether these rights concern ourselves or others. And then our community is also where we find our support for our rights. What I gathered from this section is basically what we learn about our rights come from our ethical communities, and then also the environment that has taught us the things that we know and the things that we do is basically what taught our rights. So even though sometimes our rights, we may not agree with what the rights are, we still know them. And, sometimes we still abide by them, even if we don't think that, they're right. The next section was values. What are values? When values are being discussed, we are referring to behaviors. The various environmental circumstances are where our behaviors come from, which gives us our values. An example of this, what I thought of is, I was always told when I was younger, respect your elders. This is the desired behavior that comes from the elders. So they feel like that's what needs to be desired. So it was passed down to me that that's what needs to be desired, is to respect my elders. And then also our values beyond science. Our values beyond science is the next section. So our behavior, or the way we act during activities, will either reinforce the behavior during the activity or produce punishers during the activity. This will help with what we value and what we don't value. Values are also seen as tacting when we use words like should or ought. We are describing what we or what a person should do because we see it as valuable. Good example of this is, I know when I was younger, my mom used to tell me before going out the door, put on a jacket. She's telling me to put on a jacket because she values my warmth. So since she values my warmth, I put on a jacket, and then that helps me to value my warmth as well. Translating value statements into behavioral terms greatly eases the scientific challenge of addressing values and their implications for individuals and society. Some will argue that cultural values are different from behaviors. Within this section of the book, it definitely talks about how some people feel like values and behaviors are two different things. So sometimes it's easier, instead of looking at it that way, sometimes it's easier to look at it as like it comes from the same place and that they mesh together. So when they mesh together and when it comes from the same place, you can kind of see and understand why a person may act a certain way or do a certain behavior. The last section was taking heat out of arguments, and what I gathered from this section was, in order for it not to be a heated debate when it comes to values and verbal behavior, it is best to get others to understand that values are a part of the verbal behavior. Um, what I gathered from this section, other than this bullet, was that um, it's best, instead of getting into a heated argument about values and behaviors and how they mesh and go together, it's best to get people to understand why we feel this way. And when we feel this way, and when we explain to them why we feel this way, it's best to be reasonable but help others to understand that value statements are verbal behavior. And also when we go more in depth with this, we look at example and not only facts. But when we look at the facts and the examples, we make sure to have evidence that this is valid. So my second question to you guys is, what do you feel is the biggest difference between values and rights? And just a reminder, my first question is, do you agree with the example about Tobin, which is he felt that choice should not be looked at as a value? So if you feel this way, why or why not? Thank you guys. Have a good night.